You're ready, Michael.
Well, a very good evening, everybody, and welcome here to the University of Manchester for this debate as part of Manchester Policy Week 2014. My name is Michael Taylor. I'll be chairing this debate tonight. It gives me great pleasure to be back here at the University of Manchester, where I enjoyed 3 very happy years as an undergraduate, and I'm also very proud to serve on the alumni board here. One of my other businesses, one of my other involvements is this project called Discuss Manchester, which you can see the banner there, and I've left a little flyer on each of your seats. We put debates on in the city. It's very important to us, I think, for the city to engage with the big issues of the day, and it was in the spirit of engagement, of liaising with the university, who have supported our venture, that I agreed tonight to be the host and the chair for this debate tonight. While I'll be sorting out the slides so it looks very presentable in front of you rather than a Microsoft holding page, I'll introduce each of the speakers. They're going to speak for 12 minutes, and I am going to police that quite vigorously. We don't want to go over. And then the most important part of the evening then takes place, ladies and gentlemen, which is you asking them questions, which is you making your points about this very, very important subject, about TTIP and what it means for all of us. Because I think there's a whole cloak of misunderstanding around it. And that's what we're going to try to peel back tonight, isn't it? Each of you. You promise to do that? Thank you. Right, ladies and gentlemen, while I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who invited me to come up and chair tonight's debate. Please give a very warm welcome to Gabrielle Siles-Brugge, a lecturer in politics at the University of Manchester, specialising in EU and trade politics. Our first speaker, Gabrielle.
Yeah, no worries. Well, can you hear me at the back? Yeah, okay. I've got a loud voice. I always get told off in restaurants and on the train. But actually, for this occasion, it's quite a good thing that I've got a loud voice. So if you can't hear me, raise your hand and I'll shout some more. So as one of the organisers of today's debate, I think it's incumbent upon me to thank a few people, for making this debate possible. First of all, thanks to Michael for chairing and for agreeing to moderate this debate. Thanks to our panelists, who we will hear from a bit more later. There's a number of other people who we need to thank who are a bit more behind the scenes and who need perhaps a more extensive mention at this point. First of all, I should thank Sophie King, who initially instigated the event, and she's based at the Institute for Development Policy and Management. So, very much, the reason this debate is taking place is very much because Sophie had an idea about holding a debate to inform people about TTIP. So I'm very grateful to her. I'd also like to thank Rowena Harding from the Brooks World Poverty Institute, who has done some phenomenal publicity for this event and is the reason why we've got a pretty much full house here tonight. She's designed much better posters than I could ever dream of. So, I owe her a lot. I'd also like to thank Ella Byford, who's been very helpful in terms of setting up the room and dealing with practical issues. And of course, Alex Waddington, who's the coordinator of Policy Week, who's done a phenomenal job. And thank you very much for giving us the slot this year to talk about TTIP. Anyway, I've just eaten into 2 of my minutes, I'm sure, so let me get straight to the point. My role really today in kicking off the discussion is to provide a bit of a context on TTIP, because you might think, well, what is this acronym? It's pronounced in 2 different ways, TTIP, TTIP, what does it mean? And in a sense, my role is to take, at least in this initial talk, is to take a little bit of a back seat and let our policy practitioners, in particular, Polly and David, find out some of the issues. Although, suffice to say, and for the sake of disclosure, I obviously have my own views on this. I don't sit on the fence. Just to give you a brief idea of what my view is, because of course that colours, any sort of discussion I might give. My view is that the agreement, I think, is being missold as a way of generating growth and jobs, and actually it potentially has a negative, or it can have the potential to have a negative deregulatory impact, diluting a number of hard-fought social and environmental protections. I mean, this is my position, and I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A, but for tonight, my role is really a bit more framing the discussion and looking at it from the lens of a political scientist, as it were. And in that vein, what I'm going to be talking about is 3 things. First of all, the changing nature of trade negotiations, because the TTIP, in a way, represents a new generation of trade deals. which are less about tariffs and more about what are called behind-the-border measures. Secondly, this points towards what the controversies are in the TTIP, and my argument is that these controversies are less about what you could call distributive questions, who gets what, when, and where, and more about normative questions, the sort of values that inform economic policymaking. And then thirdly, time, this leads me to the conclusion that I think it makes it, because this is a battle about values, I think it's very difficult in this context, and given some of the implications of TTIP, to sell the agreement purely in terms of economics, as a number of parties have tried to do. Anyway, let me start off with a brief, let me try and put the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, into a broader perspective. And the thing to note is that TTIP isn't unique or the first instance of a new type of trade agreement, but it's sort of perhaps the most extensive evolution of this. And it represents a big shift in the nature of trade negotiations since the post-war global trading system was set up in 1947. And when it was set up in 1947, the so-called General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was very much focused at regulating, what are called at-the-border measures, tariffs in particular, so taxes on imports. And what it was explicitly designed to sort of, give governments quite a bit of regulatory room. So the idea was to liberalize trade, but to do so in a context of an emerging welfare state that was, in a number of cases, or emerging welfare states, I should say, which are in quite a number of cases quite interventionist. And so the academic literature refers to this as the embedded liberal compromise. But of course, as tariffs have become less important because they've been cut over various rounds of the GATT, tariffs in 1947 were about, the world average tariff was about 13%. By the middle of the Doha round in 2007, it was only 4%, so tariffs have become a lot less important issue. So the discussion has shifted for a variety of reasons to focus a lot more on what are so-called behind-the-border measures. So, this is really about negotiating in a trade context about, the sort of regulations that shape the way, economies operate. And in particular, during the Uruguay round of trade negotiations that took place over the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of these issues became entrenched within the global trading system. Things like intellectual property rights, the regulation of intellectual property rights, providing strong intellectual property rights protection, and that's been quite controversial in the debate over of access to medicines. Trade-related investment measures, so the impact that particular investment measures like trade balancing requirements, the requirement to have as an investor to balance, have a particular content. Of locally produced content in investment, that's been something that's been quite controversial. And the GATT, so the General Agreement on Trade and Services, again quite controversial in the early 2000s in particular, because there was a fear that this would lead to the privatization of public services and so on. And so basically trade's become increasingly about what happens not just at the border in the form of tariffs, but also in terms of the regulation more broadly in society. And as the Doha round and the multilateral trading system has stagnated, or there's been difficulty in moving that agenda behind the border liberalization forward, actors like the United States and the EU, which have been quite favorable to this agenda, have pushed for this agenda in bilateral free trade agreements. And in a sense, the TTIP represents the culmination of that agenda because it's the most ambitious sort of agenda of regulatory convergence that exists. And so just to give you a brief overview of what the TTIP well, I'll give you a brief overview of what the TTIP is about, but before I do that, what I want to talk about is what this sort of broader change in the nature of trade negotiations, means from my perspective as a political scientist. And so, for me, the changing nature of this means a changing nature to the politics of trade. And trade nowadays is less about, who gets what and where, who benefits from, the elimination of a tariff. Is it the textile sector that loses out? Is it this sector that wins out? It's less about that and more about the sorts of values or the sorts of ideas that inform the way in which we should regulate our societies. Obviously, distributive questions are still important, but when we're talking about well, should governments be able to set content requirements for their investors? Should governments be able to issue compulsory licenses for pharmaceuticals? These are issues which, although they have distributive consequences, are largely about broader value-based choices that societies make. Ultimately, the questions that become relevant are not who gains from trade liberalization, but what role should the state play in regulating particular environmental, social risks. And so as a result, this means that the conflicts in trade policy are no longer just between firms or purely economic actors, but also, which might be fighting out over the, who gets what from a trade liberalization negotiation, which sector gets liberalized and therefore benefits, and which sector is maybe, import competing and therefore doesn't want to see liberalization, right? It's also about, what the ramifications are of trade negotiations for a wider set of objectives in health and social and environmental protection. So, in the context of TTIP, of course, these issues become even more important because in TTIP, tariffs are a very small part of the negotiation, arguably still significant for some sectors like textiles, but the key issue in TTIP is really the issue of regulatory convergence, right? The remaining barriers to trade between the EU and the US are very much down to differences in the way that the EU and the US regulate, their economies, particularly, social, environmental, and other risks. And so, the intention of negotiators is to, try and, bridge this gap in a way. And of course, this has all sorts of implications. In my view, largely potentially negative, although of course the TTIP hasn't been negotiated yet. The negotiations are ongoing, so, the outcome is fundamentally uncertain. But, the conflicts that have emerged around this, given that this is largely about regulatory convergence, and to an extent also about protecting investor rights, given the, the controversies, given, the importance of investor-to-state dispute settlement, which I'm sure my esteemed panelists will talk a little bit more about, it's much more difficult to sell this agreement because, you're not talking about a purely distributive conflict. When you're just talking about distributing the goodies from trade liberalization and minimizing the bads, what you can do is you can always, in a trade negotiation, you can protect your sensitive sectors, you can buy them off by giving them, a sort of subsidy or whatever, or you can discursively, you can talk about, you can just frame them as protectionist. And protectionist is one of those dirty words that you can thrust at someone to make their arguments not seem particularly credible, particularly in the trade world. And this was, in a sense, what was done over, previous trade agreements like the EU Korea Free Trade Agreement. The sort of automobile industry was opposed because it would lose out on the whole, and so, it was labeled as a protectionist hangover. But as you'll hear from the debate on the blogosphere, it's very difficult to talk about, or to label people protectionists who raise concerns about environmental protection, about health, and so on, and about democratic accountability and about national sovereignty. You can't just label them protectionists, and you can't just buy them off. So, when you frame the whole idea of the negotiations about values rather than the distribution of goodies or bads, or then it's much more difficult to sell it. And it's much more difficult to sell it, particularly when you talk about, in terms of economic benefits, because, it's very hard to quantify, what some of these potential problems might be in terms of economic benefits. 2 minutes. Well, I'm ahead of schedule then. I'm not saying in any way that this is necessarily a new phenomenon. This in a way mirrors some of the debates that people were having in the late 1990s and early 2000s in the context of the anti-globalization movement, the start of the multilateral trade round at the time, what was called the Millennium Round, and then became the Doha Round, debates around the multilateral agreement on investment. But what I'm suggesting, I guess, in TTIP is that this is the sort of, not only the latest iteration, but that TTIP, in terms of its ambition, because it covers so many issues, is, in a way, quantitatively different. It's a particularly heated debate as a result. So, just to conclude, never thought I'd be ahead of schedule, but there we go. Maybe I've spoken too fast. That might be the issue. But hopefully, I'm hoping that, in this talk, I haven't been too technical. Obviously, in 12 minutes, there's only so much I can cover, and I had to thank some people at the beginning. But, which I don't regret in any way, but obviously eats into my time. But what I'm hopefully I've set the scene for is this idea that what we've got in TTIP is a repoliticization of the debate about trade, and I think we're here on a Tuesday night, 7 p.m., and we've got a full room. And when I was doing my PhD on trade politics a number of years ago, I could have, I would have been happy, if 10 people showed up to me giving a short talk about trade politics, and on an evening where people could be at the pub instead, that would have been even more surprising. So, clearly there's this repoliticization of trade politics, and what I would argue is that a large part of that is because it's, increasingly about normative questions, which people have a particularly strong connection to. I would argue, although others might disagree with me, that I think this puts advocates of the TTIP on the defensive, and I think a lot of advocates have admitted that they've not really been able to communicate the benefits of TTIP as well as they'd like to, and that's because in my view it's very hard to counter arguments that are or it's very hard from a position where you're talking about economic gains you know, as trade policymakers often do, to counter arguments, you know, premised on, you know, very different, you know, a very different ground on values. Which is not to say that the jobs and growth argument they offer here in the context of TTIP isn't powerful, particularly for parties of the left, like the Labour Party, for example. It's just to say that it's very difficult to articulate that sort of, you know, positive argument and not face considerable criticism. Yeah, and that's it. I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations, Gabe, for almost sticking to time as well. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Clive George, a visiting professor from the College of Europe in Bruges and the author of The Truth About Trade. Ladies and gentlemen, Clive George.
Hello everyone, can you hear me at the back? Yeah, good. I might quieten down, so if I do, just wave your hands like Gabriel said. So it really is great to see so many people interested in the trade agreement. There's been absolutely nothing like it, in my experience, since 1999 in Seattle, the Battle of Seattle, some of you will remember that, World Trade Organization conference that fell apart with protesters blocking the streets and developing countries refusing to accept the agenda. I was working here at Manchester University at the time, and out of that I got drawn into a series of studies of trade agreements called sustainability impact assessments, which aimed to identify what the impacts of these things were really likely to be. We started with the Seattle proposals, we went on to look at the Doha agenda that followed them, and then a series of bilateral agreements that the European Commission has been negotiating in parallel. That kept me busy until 5 or 6 years ago when I retired, since when my life of leisure has been interrupted now and again, as Michael said, by tripping over to the College of Europe in Belgium, trying to prepare future bureaucrats for what lies ahead of them. So with that little background, I find TTIP utterly intriguing. First of all, it's been trumpeted by David Cameron and lots of other people as the biggest trade deal ever, whereas Gabriel said to us, it's hardly a trade agreement at all in conventional terms. It is an investment agreement and a regulatory harmonisation agreement. So what sorts of things it's all about is if I'm a manufacturer trying to sell one of these things, 3-pin plug, I cannot sell that in the United States of America. I'm going to make one of those things instead with only 2 pins on it. So that means I've got to have 2 production lines instead of 1, and it's going to cost me quite a bit more. So I'm sure that if I don't say myself, David will tell me in a moment that 3-pin plugs are not actually on the agenda. And if we asked him, he would probably tell us that making us all drive on the right-hand side of the road for the convenience of the motor industry is not on the agenda either. But there are one hell of a lot of very similar things that are rather less obvious to the unsuspecting public that are on the agenda. So it's really very like what we set out to do when we created the Common Market and then the European Union on the way to becoming a Euro-American Union. Personally, no problem with that. I've got problems with quite a lot of details, but no problem with that in principle. I've no problem in general with the way the European Union runs itself. Well, not in general. There are some things that I think are pretty lousy there too. But on the whole, I am a big fan of the European Union. And if all the laws and regulations that got made in Brussels were made in the middle of the Atlantic instead, I would not have any serious objection to it. But I do find it exceedingly odd that Tory backbenchers who want us out of Europe aren't up in arms about TTIP, and even odder, it doesn't send UKIP absolutely ballistic. I can think of reasons why that might be the case, but they're not at all obvious. It gets even more intriguing to me when you start looking at the numbers. We're told that TTIP will boost the European economy by 120 billion euros. Sounds great, it's only 0.5% of the European economy. And according to the economists who did the sums for the European Commission, it would take at least 10 years to realise that 0.5%. So that's 0.5% in a decade. Before the 2008 European economic crisis, European economy was growing at 30% a decade, for decade after decade. And all that we get from TTIP, according to this, is a miserable 0.5% a decade. Less than 1/60th of what we would need to get back to where we were before the 2008 crisis. So what on earth are they bothering about? Why are they bothering with it? Either they're completely stupid, or there's something else going on that they are not going to tell us about. And that, ladies and gentlemen, would be par for the course for a trade agreement. Governments negotiate trade agreements for all sorts of reasons, sometimes extremely complicated. But they like to promote them with nice, simple numbers that make good sound bites. The trouble is that the economic methods that are used in order to provide those numbers are not capable of doing much more than sticking some numbers on David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which he produced back in the 1820s, to try and persuade the world that free trade is good for everybody. It wasn't until powerful low-cost computers came on the scene that you could solve the simultaneous equations which allow you to put some numbers on the theory. And the numbers did at first seem quite big, but then as the data got better, the numbers came down, 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 so that by the time we got to Doha, they were predicting that developing countries would gain about the same as what they're now predicting for TTIP, 0.5% in a decade. Any developing country that gets its act together should be achieving vastly more than 0.5% decade growth. In the 3 decades, the whole of the 3 decades, from 1962 to 1992, South Korea grew at over 100% a decade. The 3 decades from 1982 to 2012, China grew at over 120% a decade. And all that we're offered out of those sums is 0.5% a decade. And those sums can be just as wrong in the opposite direction. If you're a developing country struggling to industrialize, and you allow yourself to sign up to a trade agreement that locks you into exporting your natural resources and importing everything else, you are going to kill your development prospects stone dead. And you cannot capture anything like that with a set of simultaneous equations. Trade economics models can be very useful. They can be particularly useful when you're looking at the likely effects of a trade agreement on a particular industry. What's going to happen in this country or that country in relation to that particular industry or whatever. But when it comes to attempting to evaluate the overall impact on the country's economy, they are virtually useless. The European Court of Auditors has very nearly said exactly that itself. And that's the official body set up to make sure the European Commission does its job properly. And they undertook an audit of the way the Commission manages its trade policy, which they reported on earlier this year. And in that audit report, they identified inherent limitations and weaknesses in the economic models and data sets used, such that they are only suitable for simulation and not for forecasting. And in particular, they described in the audit attempts to simulate the most important effects as tenuous. Now you might think that American European trade ministries would feel a little bit worried by all of that. Not in the least. They don't use these calculations for working out what policies to adopt. They only use them for promoting the policies they've adopted. That little observation is backed up by European Union's chief scientific advisor. She's looked at how the European Commission analyses the impacts of all its policy proposals, and she accuses the Commission of twisting facts to fit its political agenda. Now, in my experience, it would be a wild exaggeration to say that they do that all the time. But the use of these silly numbers to promote trade policy is a very clear example of it. For trade with low and middle income countries, Europe's agenda is actually fairly well defined. It was set out in a document called Global Europe, Competing in the World, which did not mention any of these numbers from trade economics models, but focused solidly on efforts to persuade low and middle income countries to remove their remaining barriers to European exports, while opening up, granting Europe the complete access to their resources of raw materials. Which to me sounds a little bit post-imperial, but at least it does make sense. The official review of Europe's Lisbon strategy for growth and jobs called it maintaining Europe's position at the top of the global economic league table. That makes sense too, but there is an obvious corollary to that. If we're going to keep Europe at the top of the global economic league table, we do have to make sure that somebody else stays at the bottom in the hard world in which we live. When the Commission updated trade strategy in 2010, it included TTIP as a key part of it. But the only reason it gave for that was this same old 0.5%. They didn't mention the decade, it was just 120 billion euros ago. So that leaves us to make our own guesses as to what TTIP might really be all about. There are two main schools of thought that I've come across. The first one suggests that all the possibly nasty effects, which Polly's likely to be talking about in a minute, such as locking in privatisation of public services and putting in the hands of transnational corporations, are not unfortunate side effects of the deal, but its specific purpose. So that's theory number one, which we might call neoliberalism by stealth. The other school of thought says that TTIP is a response to the growing geopolitical power of China, India, Brazil, to some extent Russia, the BRICS countries. Until the battle in Seattle in 1999, Europe and America had pretty much all their own way in defining global trade rules. In 1999, a group of developing countries led by India said no. They've been saying no ever since. Doha negotiations have been going nowhere. Europe and America have had to make do with a series of smaller deals with individual countries or groups of countries, many of which are going nowhere too. So the theory has it, if the EU and the United States can create a single giant trade bloc, it would have so much power in the global economy that the rest of the world would have little option but to join in and sign up to the Euro-American rules. That one sounds a bit to me like post-imperialism by stealth. And quite a lot of credence has been given to it by the United States ambassador to the European Union. And this is what he said. There are critical geostrategic reasons to get this deal done. Every day I'm reminded of the global context of why we're negotiating TTIP. We need this deal to help solidify further the Transatlantic alliance, to provide an economic equivalent to NATO, and to set the rules of world trade before others do it for us. So that does seem to suggest that the real aim of TTIP is indeed to try and turn the clock back to 1999. Will it work? What if it doesn't? What if China and the others won't play ball and set up their own rules for their own game? We can only guess about it. It's another one you cannot calculate with a set of simultaneous equations. So those are two main schools of thought. That's what it's all about. It might be one, it might be other, it might be both, or it might be something else. We don't know. The only thing that we can be absolutely sure of is there is much more to it than a miserable 120 billion euros.
Well done, Clive. Thank you very much indeed. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce a campaigner very much on the whole issue of TTIP. Polly Jones is the head of policy and a campaigner with the World Development Movement, which campaigns for justice for the world's poor. Please give a very warm Manchester welcome to Polly Jones.
be here this evening. I'm glad you're not in a pub, as Gabriel suggested. First of all, I'd just really like to say thanks very much to the University of Manchester and Gabriel and his colleagues for organising this. As far